Awesome. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our workshop. My colleague Prab Simran Saini and I are honored to be here today to chat with you about how to incorporate your clients' cultural foods to support their health goals. So it's going to be really, really impactful, really knowledgeable, and you're going to walk away with amazing practical tools that you can use in your practice starting today. So for those who do not know me, nice to meet you. I'm Trista Chan. I am a registered dietitian and founder of the Good Life Dietitian. I've obtained a Master of Health Science in Nutrition Communication from Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly known as Ryerson, and a Bachelor of Applied Science in Human Nutrition from the University of Guelph. I am incredibly passionate about supporting clients through my one-on-one practice, particularly those diagnosed with endocrine disorders like PCOS, functional gut disorders, and disordered eating. My goal is to help them find recovery through the power of good food. And within this work, I'm a huge advocate of providing culturally responsive care. My experiences as a first generation Chinese Canadian and just being born and raised in the Greater Toronto area, which you likely know is a very diverse city, I'm incredibly passionate about advocating for and practicing culturally sensitive and responsive care for patients because that is what I believe the only way to improve their health outcomes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Perp Simran Sani, and I'm a registered dietitian at the Good Life Dietitian as well. Similar to Trista, I also obtained my Master's of Health Science and Nutrition Communication from Ryerson University, and my undergrad, I got a Bachelor of Applied Science and Nutrition and Food from, Toronto Metropolitan University. Apologies. It's TMU now, Toronto Metropolitan University. But at the Good Life Dietitian, I specialize in PCOS and chronic disease. And again, similar to Trista, I'm a very, very strong advocate that cultural foods can make a healthy plate. I live with PCOS myself and was often told that I needed to give up my cultural foods, give up my roti and my rice to see any improvements in my health. And I thought that was absolute nonsense. So being one of the very few South Asian dietitians in Canada, it's kind of become my mission to help clients incorporate their cultural foods in a way that supports their health goals. And like again, Trista said, it's the only way to do it because that's what's going to increase their adherence. That's what's going to increase their health outcomes at the end of the day.
So a little bit about you now, right? Have you ever in your practice felt frustrated that your nutrition recommendations never seem to be followed, right? Maybe you pour your heart out in your initial assessment with a new patient, you give them what you think are appropriate nutrition recommendations, right? And then they come back and they haven't implemented any of it. And I get it, that is so, so frustrating. And in many cases, it may not be the patient, and that's why we're here today, right? To learn how to practice better, effective care. Or maybe you know that some recommendations that we're trained to provide classically as dietitians may not be the most culturally appropriate, right? But you're feeling kind of like in this in between where you're not sure what to do next. You're feeling kind of self-conscious. There's a little bit of like apprehension about seeing different clients from different cultural backgrounds because you generally don't know much about their cultural food or their cultural practices, and you don't want to, offend them in any way, right? So, not to worry, we're here today to provide you all those practical tools. But before we get started, I want you to just take a moment just to reflect a little bit on what culture means to you, right? Because it's so individualized. Different people view their own identities differently, right? So culture essentially just means the way of life shared by people. And this can include customary beliefs, shared attitudes, values, goals, and it really influences pretty much the aspect of everything we do, how we eat, how we speak, right? Our beliefs. And it can be quite complex. It's fluid, it's individualized. There are so many different layers to one's culture. So for example, I'm a first generation Chinese Canadian. My own identity and my culture is very different from my parents who are immigrants, right? Who moved here and are now Canadian citizens as Chinese immigrants. So something to keep in mind as we are moving through this presentation, right? And as you start working or continue working with patients of different cultural backgrounds, right? What does culture mean to them and what is their own self-identity? And what are the layers that you can go back and support with your patients? And here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to cover how to actually unlearn assumptions on healthy eating. Right? We're going to expand what healthy eating looks like and take a strengths-based approach where you can learn to genuinely respect and acknowledge the nutrition that can be found in everyone's foods, because we know that dietetics nutrition care isn't one size fits all. We're going to chat a little bit about practicing cultural humility versus competency. And cultural competence is a great first step, right? But let's strive for more cultural humility by committing to reflexive, lifelong learning. And finally, Prab is going to share some excellent practical tools for you to take a collaborative approach with your clients. Right? So when we Google healthy meals, right, this is what pops up. And this is what I literally Googled yesterday morning. It's been years, I feel like, where we've had conversations and discussions around diversifying dietetic care, yet still this is that dominant narrative, right, that we view as healthy eating. So we are taught a very narrow definition of what healthy eating looks like. And this is something that I was certainly taught and practiced, honestly, for the first few years, right? Because that's what I was taught in my undergrad, is that we view nutrition with a very eurocentric lens. And what that means is that the focus of healthy is placed oftentimes on European culture and history, and other cultures' foods are sidelined. This implicitly implies that European culture is superior to others, and it's really rooted in a history of colonialism and white supremacy in Canada. Yes, these foods are nutrient dense. Absolutely. We see leafy greens, right? We see whole grains, starchy veggies, lean protein, so powerful and nutrient dense, but it is not the be all and all that's implied, right? So I remember vividly being an undergrad, moving into residence, my first year, super exciting, meeting my roommate, and within the first few weeks telling her that I like to eat noodles for breakfast sometimes, right? My wonton noodles. And I got the most visceral, like, ew reaction to that. And I'm sure that's something you've experienced a lot from growing up as well. I see some nodding, unfortunately. And there was just so much shame and conditioning and just like an instant reaction to assume that's unhealthy, right? Because it's Chinese noodles for breakfast versus other more acceptable foods that are still carb heavy, right? Like cereals, oats, right? Whole grain bread, right? I knew my cultural dish was healthy. I had some protein from the wontons, some carbs from the noodles, I had some veggies, some bok choy was filled with scallions, right? So this is really just about challenging that cookie cutter and instant reflexive approach we have to nutrition, then really expanding our dietary interventions and changing that narrative. And why is it so important is because Canada is diverse. And these are stats that I pulled directly from Stats Canada. There are over 450 ethnic or cultural origins reported in the 2021 census. So Canada is beautiful, it's diverse, there's so much strength in that. And let's leverage that strength, right? And change our narrative to meet that. So what happens when we advise this really diverse group of people, every single one with their own lived experiences, different backgrounds, preferred foods, with different food memories, comfort foods, understanding of something, and we try to take this over 450, different groups and distill them down into one way of eating, into that cookie cutter approach, is that it doesn't fit, right? It simply doesn't fit and it simply does not work. And we want to do well as healthcare providers, right? We want to support our patients. And this is just another piece of data that kind of drives that point home. This is essentially looking at Canadians and identifying different places of birth. So you'll see here that what looks, I think, like more than half of Canadians' place of birth is in Asia. Another big chunk, place of birth, Europe. We see the Americas here. We see Africa here, right? So there is so much different experiences that we want to expand our recommendations to. And why should we care? Simply put, culture influences what and when people eat, period, right? Culture definitely influences how I eat. Culture definitely influences how Prob eats, how you listening here today eats. And our clients are no different. They're people just like us, right? So, developing understanding and awareness of different cultural beliefs and practices as it relates to nutrition, such as different eating patterns, food sources, is essential to build rapport and help your clients feel seen, which is a core piece of that therapeutic relationship between dietitian and patient, and is one of those main determining factors for success. So it is so crucial to address cultural misconceptions and stereotypes around dietary behaviors and traditional approaches to food security. This even relates to food security, right? I think traditional approaches to food security often emphasize food availability, access, income, but food security must take cultural factors into account, right? So simply put, if it's not culturally responsive, it may not be effective, and particularly in a country like Canada, where we know from data that Indigenous, immigrant, and racialized populations are disproportionately affected by food insecurity. That, coupled with the small amount of nutrition support that they do get, if it doesn't meet their cultural needs and it's not responsive, that further widens the gap and it further increases health disparities in our society. So this is a very common scenario that we've seen in our settings, our many different workplace settings, whether you're in private practice, whether you're in a family health team, community health center, outpatient ambulatory care, right? Is imagine a Chinese patient with a high-risk pregnancy and prediabetes struggles to make dietary changes to manage her blood sugars. Her comfort food is red bean soup dessert made by her grandmother. Love that. Delicious as a fellow Chinese person. At her initial assessment, the dietitian is doing that food recall and she hears the word dessert, advises the patient to eliminate it, right? The patient finds this incredibly difficult. In the follow-up, the irritated dietitian finds out that the patient hasn't eliminated this red bean soup dessert, and the patient is discharged, labeled as non-compliant, advised her once again to stop eating carbs and end the session with no continued support. So this clearly isn't an ideal scenario. It's one where the dietitian isn't practicing culturally responsive and culturally competent care, right? Whereas if in a scenario the dietitian listened, it could have been a much different turnout. Maybe they could have learned that red bean soup, although called dessert, can be modified in terms of added sugars. Maybe they would have learned that red bean is that main staple ingredient, excellent protein and fiber, right? And even though it's called dessert, it is part of that patient's cultural food comfort and tradition, right? It can absolutely work with that to adjust different factors to stabilize their blood sugars. So remember that we are in the business of caring for people and we all have good intentions, right? That's why we entered nutrition and dietetic care, because we want to help people. We want to care for our clients. And in order for that to translate to better health outcomes, we must provide culturally responsive care. So this is a wheel of power, and I just want to throw this in there because it is a conceptual framework which I find applies to nutrition care, healthcare, any kind of scenario, and essentially just illustrates different power dynamics and privilege within society. So as you move outward from the center of the wheel, you can encounter identities that are oftentimes associated with marginalized or oppressed groups, such as racialized people, women, LGBTQ plus individuals, people with disabilities, right? Lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So just keeping this in mind when you are working with different patients, right? This wheel of power. There's so much interconnectedness with our social identities. There's so many different intersections, and there's always going to be power dynamics within healthcare, right? We are dietitians being aware of how that patient provider kind of relationships with that power dynamics, and then further how these different points of the wheel of power, right, impact that as well. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about reframing and unlearning what healthy eating looks like. And that next step is to practice a little bit of cultural humility. And what that is, right, is basically just a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation, self-critique, right? And it really starts within, right? And this is something that we're both continuing to work towards, right? It's that continued process. What am I believing? Is this rooted in more of a eurocentric lens, right? Is this rooted in someone's truth, right? And examining our own identities as well. So previously, this was more so coined as cultural competence. And cultural competence is a framework, right? And it can that emphasizes that competence exists on a continuum. It's not meant to be definitive, but it does allow people and or organizations to kind of gauge where they're at and plan for growth. But a very common and valid criticism around that is that you technically can't truly ever be competent in someone else's culture, right? It is so individualized. So we try to use that word and that verbiage, cultural humility, is really that um, best thing to strive towards, right? There is no end point, right? So once again, it is that lifelong process rooted in respect, understanding power dynamics, and a really key piece of cultural humility is that we see our clients, our patients as individuals, not as a representative collective of a culture, a race, or an ethnicity, right? So, for example, if you're working with an African American patient with hereditary coronary artery disease, like we're not going to assume that they eat soul food. Maybe they're a vegan, right? So this person is an individual as well, right? And not representative of their world group. And one thing to always be mindful of is, cultural appreciation versus appropriation, right? And this is something that dietitians should absolutely be mindful of um, from many standpoints, not just with one-on-one clients or developing meal plans, but there's many kind of opportunities for dietitians to unintentionally wade into the cultural appropriation territory, right? So if you're writing recipes, food blogging, culinary education, creating food demos. And there's a little bit of a subtle but distinct difference with appreciating culture versus appropriating. And appropriating is really when you take a culturally significant practice from one group, usually from a marginalized group, like a racialized group, and turning that into something that benefits someone else, right, without giving due credits or acknowledgments, and ultimately kind of erasing its original meaning. So a few questions to ask, right? And is when you're creating content, when you're advising on food recommendations, perhaps creating meal plans, these are just a few guiding questions to help you kind of identify which kind of category you're falling into, and then taking the steps, right, to mitigate that, right? So if you're intentionally appropriating, maybe some of these questions can help just kind of nudge you more towards that appreciation end of that spectrum, right? And what this looks like when it comes to more of a practical standpoint is I'll give you an example of a very common scenario that I think has made its ways in food bloggers, mainstream food media. So let's say after visiting an Indian restaurant and trying masala dosa, a nutritionist goes home to prepare her own masala dosa with new spices and ingredients. She then claims it as her own in an online blog, likely veering towards cultural appropriation side, right? There wasn't any there. If we're going back to this list of questions, the culture is not from her own, right? Wasn't giving credits to the origins, wasn't really amplifying someone else's voice in that opportunity. Whereas what appreciation would have looked like in that scenario is after visiting an Indian restaurant and trying masala dosa, a woman tries to make it at home. She does research on the methods and history and enjoys it. She makes some modifications, but explains the dish's origins with references. Her experience at the restaurant, she explains, and she also explains her adaptations on the blog. which is awesome. So for going back to the list of questions, right, she's done the research to understand the origins. She's given credit to the original restaurant and the references, the sources. She's delivering the information respectfully. She made some modifications. She was transparent about that. Okay. So just to reiterate, right, we're expanding what healthy eating looks like. Step one, step two, we're starting to work towards, when we are speaking of other cultures or advising on that, cultural appreciation versus cultural appropriation. And then Paul is going to take it from here and just give you some practical tips on how to actually make that happen for your clients.
Yeah, and now we're going to move towards more tangible steps and steps that you can take to work with your clients. And it's really important with working with culturally diverse clients to know that their views, their perceptions, their culture, their experiences are so valid and so important. And that's where collaboration is such an important skill, right? Both client and practitioner must work together and learn from each other to achieve the best health and nutrition outcomes, but also create practical goals which will make sense in their lifestyle and their setting, right? While a dietitian or a practitioner may have that nutrition knowledge, the medical knowledge needed to guide and empower the client, it's so important to remember that the client is the expert when it comes to their personal health history, their culture, their food practices, their symptoms. And as healthcare professionals, it's so important that we take a step back and listen to our clients and learn from them about their food traditions, their nutrition needs, and health goals. So this is our three-step framework to being culturally inclusive. Most food guides, including our very own Canadian Food Guide, they sort of identify these main groups like protein, starch, and non-starchy vegetables to be the most important elements of a balanced meal. And I really love the whole visuals that our new food guide gives, because we can actually use this for our culturally diverse clients and help them understand as well where their ingredients fit into the three main groups and how their meals and their cuisines can make balanced meals. So I personally feel that the new food guide provides this opportunity to empower culturally diverse individuals to be like, hey, I think my meals are also healthy because they kind of fit into these groups that the food guide is displaying, right? Being South Asian myself and working with many other ethnic minorities and also many South Asians, when a high risk group comes in, like having a new diagnosis of whether that's diabetes or PCOS, they oftentimes blame it on their diet. They're like, hey, I eat these foods, it's not healthy, and that's why I have this. And I just want to tell them to hold on, let's break it down, kind of pull up the food guide and be like, hey, list me the meals you're eating. Let's break down the ingredients and do these fit in this guide? And then it helps to kind of reframe their mindset and empower them like, oh, wait, I'm putting all this blame on my diet, but maybe it's not so bad, right? Because in their head, they're so used to seeing, like Trista mentioned earlier, conventionally, when we Google foods, what's considered healthy, right? So I think that using the food guide as a framework is so empowering to help visually you help your clients see that, hey, the ingredients you cook with can make a balanced meal. Next, Trista.
Oh, is it not switching?
No.
Hmm.
That would it.
Oh, okay. I think there's just a little bit of lag.
And what's very important is to think outside the plate. The plate model isn't a great guide, but remember, not all your clients' meals will be plated like the plate model. In some cultures, they may not even eat on a plate at all, right? So whatever educational tool you're using should really be customized to deliver culturally inclusive recommendations. And again, empowering the client to share what ingredients they're using and helping them to build a balanced meal using guidelines. And of course, one thing that I find is very important is that you can help them to adjust portions as needed. Again, the plate model is a great guide for that because it kind of helps them to see if their carb portion is heavier, how can they cut it down? How can they add more vegetables? But again, the ingredients they can use can come from their cultural foods that they're having. I think this is a very important slide, and this is a very important quote that all eating habits can have small tweaks that do not vilify or discourage anyone's cultural foods. I think as dietitians or practitioners, we sort of want to always deliver the best advice and want our clients to do everything perfectly, right? We may want them to follow the healthy plate model to absolute T, make sure they're having low GI carbs, more vegetables, more protein. But what that can actually do is end up removing a lot of cultural staple food items that your clients may actually really enjoy, and increases the joy of food and increases their joy of, connecting with their culture. Um, especially in my case, because I work with a lot of PCOS and diabetes clients, I often hear that, for a South Asian client who loves their roti and dal, they were told to let go of the roti and just eat their dal alone because it's considered a starchy protein. So that's their carb for the meal. Being my South Asian myself, I'm just like, mm-mm-mm. That's just not how you eat your dal. You need your roti, you need your rice. So instead, can we tweak something, right? Can we focus on portions instead of eliminating certain food groups, or instead of making that matching pair of that food seem bad because it's a bit high in carbs? Or another example may be like a Chinese client who loves their jasmine rice. And oftentimes I see a lot of dietitians trying to encourage them to have something more have something more low glycemic index, such as brown rice or quinoa. But again, it's just not culturally the same. It takes away from their texture. So again, trying with the client, hey, can we focus on portions again? So making those small tweaks might help them to achieve that healthy balance without giving out cultural staples they really enjoy. This is also very important, is that if you know that you might be seeing someone who's cultural, a client whose cultural you're not familiar with, it's maybe very important to do more research on the food the clients have mentioned and work together to modify and find alternatives. An example I can give is I had a Nigerian client and they loved their cornmeal, but as a dietitian and a newly practicing dietitian, I had no idea what cornmeal was, right? So in my head, I was like, okay, this seems very carb heavy. Can we eliminate? Can we try something else? But that's where it becomes very important that, I go out of my way to do the research to understand what cornmeal is. Can we make tweaks? Can we work together to find alternatives and or work together to modify the meal, which makes my client happy as well at the end of the day. But also I come with that responsibility of understanding what cornmeal is. A great way to do this or embed this into your practice can be, if you already have client intake forms, can you incorporate some open-ended questions such as, what are certain common foods that they have in a day, or who does the cooking at home, or how do they typically prepare food, or what are some cultural foods they like to eat? And if you have a list of all of these beforehand, you can kind of go on and prepare. But these are also questions you can ask in your initial assessment. And if you don't have the answer right on the spot, it's okay. We can all just go back, do our research, and get back to the client later on. A big tip is, if the food item is unfamiliar to you, it's also very important to ask the client about its ingredients and preparation methods. Of course, you can Google it, but within cultural groups, there can be a lot of differences how certain people or certain people cook those cook those recipes in a different way. So it never hurts to just cross-check with your client. So overall, to wrap it up, key takeaways from today's presentation that Tristan and I delivered is that, one, we really want to reframe our assumptions, but also check in with the narratives that we've been told and how can we restructure them, right? The most important thing is that, can we start to view healthy eating in a more culturally inclusive way, in a more colorful way, expand what it looks like. Again, take a strength-based approach where we generally respect and acknowledge nutrition that can be found in other cultural foods. And then the next part of it was cultural humility. Cultural competence is a great first step, but it shouldn't be our end goal. And we should be working towards cultural humility to understand that we will never know enough about someone's cultural cultural background, and that we want to strive for committing to reflexive lifelong learning, continually addressing our internal and external biases and practicing that reflective listening. And lastly, the most practical part of it is that how can we implement this with our clients? Can we be more collaborative, right? When we work with our client, can we co-create and both be experts in that room? And again, using that healthy plate model and asking clients to fill out their preferred ingredients in each section and then brainstorming meals together. Now, we've definitely said a lot, and oftentimes what happens with presentations or workshops that there's a gap that always remains between how much you've learned and how much you go on doing. So we wanted to support you by providing a guide that has actionable steps on how you can start today to implement a lot of the things we spoke about, start becoming more culturally inclusive and providing that responsive care. And we are providing a guide which converts a lot of that information that we deliver today into actionable steps that you can take not only individually, but as an organization to make sure that you are providing client-centered care and meeting the needs of our diverse population.
Thanks, Rob. And I want to mention as well that we are committed to continuing education, self-reflective practice, and we'd love to support you in your journey. So we do provide clinical supervision as a way to support you, dietitians or nutritionists, through professional development with a supportive relationship. We find that especially in private practice, if that is your setting, dietitians tend to work in silos, right? It can be very isolating, but it can also be a barrier in terms of ensuring that you're continuing education. So we do provide clinical supervision with a flexible approach to make the best use of your supervision sessions. So these are held in a super relaxed, non-judgmental, and safe space so you can offload, learn, and discuss client cases to better help support your clients and become a better culturally responsive practitioner as well. So if you are interested, you can just shoot us an email. It's linked down here below. Otherwise, stay in touch. Right, I've linked our socials here where you can find us and our website. So thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. And we'll hear from you soon. Bye.